The doors of the great hall slammed open before Alara Voss could catch her breath, and 4 guards pushed her forward until she stumbled onto the cold stone floor in front of the throne. She looked up, heart pounding, and saw him for the first time. Alpha King Draven Ashgrove sat with his jaw tight and his eyes sharp as blades, staring down at her like she was a problem he had not asked for. "This is the one," said General Colton, standing beside the throne with his arms crossed. "The healer from the lower village. Word says she carries your mark." Draven did not move. "Words are cheap, General. I have heard this claim before, and it cost me more than any of you understand." Alara's hands trembled against the stone floor. She did not know why she had been dragged from her cottage in the middle of the night, torn away from her sick father, and thrown before the king of the Ashgrove pack like a criminal. She only knew that the guards had barged into her home, grabbed her by the arms, and refused to explain anything, except that the king demanded her presence. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small but steady. "I have done nothing wrong." "Stand," Draven ordered. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her worn dress, refusing to let her fear show on her face, even though her stomach twisted into knots. The great hall was filled with pack members, nobles and warriors, all watching her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She felt like an animal on display. Draven stepped down from his throne, and the moment he came closer, something strange happened. His breathing changed, his eyes narrowed, and his wolf stirred beneath his skin, restless and alert. He inhaled once, sharply, and his entire body went still. "Impossible," he whispered. Alara did not understand what was happening, but she saw the shift in him immediately. The cold, commanding king, who had looked at her like she was nothing, suddenly looked at her like she was something he could not explain. "Your Majesty?" General Colton asked carefully. Draven did not answer right away. He circled her slowly, his eyes never leaving her face, and Alara forced herself to stand tall even though every instinct told her to run. She had heard stories about the Alpha King. He was said to be ruthless in battle, unshakable in politics, and utterly incapable of trust since the betrayal that nearly cost him his throne 2 years ago. A woman claiming to be his mate had used the bond to manipulate him, to turn his own guards against him, and had nearly handed the kingdom to a rival pack before she was discovered and cast out. Since then, Draven Ashgrove trusted no one who claimed any connection to him. "Where did you come from?" he asked, his voice low. "The southern village, Your Majesty. I am a healer there. I care for my father, who has been unwell for many months." "And you know nothing of why you were brought here?" "No," she said honestly. "I was told nothing, except that I must come immediately." Draven turned to General Colton. "Who reported this claim?" "An elder from her village, Your Majesty. He said her scent changed the day the moon bond ceremony took place 3 months ago. He said the pack could feel a pull toward the palace whenever she was near, as though something inside her called to something inside these walls." Draven's expression darkened. He remembered that night 3 months ago all too well. It was the night his wolf had woken him from sleep, with a pain so sharp it felt as though something had been ripped from his chest. He had dismissed it as an old wound acting up, but now, standing this close to Alara, he understood. The pain had been the bond forming, calling out to a woman he had never met, in a village he had never visited. "You felt nothing unusual?" he asked her directly. Alara hesitated. Now that she thought about it, there had been something. A night 3 months ago when she had woken suddenly, gasping, as though someone had reached into her chest and taken hold of her heart. She had told no one, afraid people would think she was losing her mind. "There was a night," she admitted slowly. "I felt pain, like something breaking inside me. I thought it was a fever." The hall fell silent. Draven's jaw tightened, and Alara could see something dangerous flicker behind his eyes, something that looked almost like fear, though a king like him would never admit to such a feeling. "I do not believe in convenient timing," Draven said finally, his voice hard again. "I have been fooled once by a woman who claimed this same bond, and it nearly destroyed everything I have built. I will not be fooled twice." "I have claimed nothing," Alara said, anger slipping into her voice despite her fear. "I did not ask to be here. I did not ask for this bond, if it even exists. I only want to go home to my father." Her boldness surprised even herself. but she refused to be treated like a liar for a truth she had not even understood until this moment. Draven studied her for a long moment, and something about her defiance seemed to convince him more than any plea for mercy could have. "There is a way to know for certain," he said at last. General Colton stepped forward, alarm crossing his face. "Your Majesty, surely you do not mean—" "I mean exactly what you think I mean." Draven cut him off. "One night. She will stay in my private chambers until dawn. If the bond is real, my wolf will recognize her fully, and there will be no mistaking it. If it is false, she returns to her village, unharmed, and this matter ends forever." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. "One night? With you?" "You have a choice," Draven said, though his tone made it clear the choice was narrow. "Agree, and if the bond proves true, you will be protected under my crown, and your father's debts to this kingdom will be cleared, whatever they may be. Refuse, and you will be escorted back to your village under suspicion, marked as a woman who ran from her king, which in this land is not a small thing to carry." Ilara's mind raced. She thought of her father, weak and struggling, buried under debts to the crown that she had no way of repaying on a healer's wage. She thought of the whispers that would follow her home if she refused, whispers that could make her family's life even harder than it already was. And she thought of the strange ache in her chest that had never fully gone away since that night 3 months ago, an ache she had never understood until this very moment. "I will do it," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. A murmur rippled through the hall. Draven studied her once more, searching her face for any sign of deception, but found nothing, except fear, exhaustion, and a stubborn kind of courage that he had not expected. "Very well," he said. "Tonight then." As the guards led her toward the palace's private wing, Ilara's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone around her could hear it. She did not know what waited for her behind those doors, whether truth or danger, but she knew there was no turning back now. Behind her, she heard Draven speaking quietly to General Colton, his voice too low to make out the words, but the tension in it was impossible to miss. "Your Majesty," Colton said once they were alone, "if this bond is real, the nobles who supported you after the last betrayal will demand proof beyond a single night. They will not easily accept another claim like this." "I know," Draven said grimly, "but I need to know first, before politics decide anything. My wolf has been restless for months, Colton. Something has been missing, and tonight, I intend to find out if it has finally been found." Ilara was led through long corridors lined with tapestries and portraits of past kings, each hallway more grand than the last, until she reached a set of heavy wooden doors, guarded by 2 silent warriors. Inside, the chamber was vast, warmed by a low fire, with tall windows overlooking the sleeping kingdom below. She had never seen anything so beautiful, and yet she had never felt so out of place. She stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself, waiting. The minutes stretched painfully long. She thought about her father at home, likely worried sick by now, wondering where she had gone. She thought about the life she had known just hours ago, simple and difficult but hers, and how quickly it had been upended by a claim she still barely understood. When the door finally opened, Draven entered alone, having removed his ceremonial robes for something simpler, though he still carried himself like a king in every movement. He studied her carefully across the room, as though trying to solve a puzzle he had been given no time to prepare for. "You do not have to be afraid," he said, his voice softer than before, though still guarded. "Nothing will happen here tonight that you do not agree to. I only need to know if what my wolf feels is true." "And if it is?" Ilara asked, meeting his eyes despite the trembling in her hands. "Then everything changes," he said simply, "for both of us." Ilara swallowed hard, unsure whether that thought terrified her, or something else entirely, something she was not ready to name. The fire crackled softly in the silence between them, and outside, the kingdom slept, unaware that within these walls a king and a stranger stood on the edge of a truth that could reshape both their lives before the sun rose again. Draven walked closer, slow and deliberate, giving her every chance to step back if she wished. She did not. Something inside her, quiet but insistent, kept her rooted in place, curious despite her fear, drawn despite her doubt. When he finally stood before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tell me your name again," he said quietly. Properly this time. "Alara," she said. "Alara Voss." He repeated it softly, almost like he was testing how it felt on his tongue, how it settled inside him. "Alara," he said again, and something in his expression shifted, a crack in the cold armor he wore so carefully. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, the silence heavy with unanswered questions, unspoken fears, and a bond neither had asked for but neither could deny, was pulling tighter with every second that passed. Whatever the night would bring, both of them understood, in that quiet moment beside the fire, that nothing about their lives would remain the same once morning came. The hours ahead would decide everything, and neither Alara nor Draven yet knew how deeply that single night would change the course of the kingdom, their pack, and the fragile trust beginning to form between two people who had every reason to doubt each other, and yet somehow could not look away. Outside the tall windows, the moon rose higher, casting silver light across the sleeping city below, indifferent to the storm quietly building within the walls of the palace. Alara did not know it yet, but the choice she had made tonight would follow her far beyond these chambers, into dangers she could not yet imagine, and into a bond that would test her courage in ways she had never faced before. For now, there was only the fire, the silence, and the king standing before her, waiting to learn the truth his wolf already seemed to know. Draven poured 2 cups of warm cider from a kettle near the fire, and offered one to Alara, though she only stared at it, unsure whether accepting even something so small meant agreeing to more than she understood. He noticed her hesitation, and set the cup down on the table beside her instead of pressing it into her hands. "You do not trust me," he said. It was not a question. "Should I?" Alara asked. "You had me dragged from my home in the middle of the night. You speak of bonds and betrayals as though I am the cause of wounds I know nothing about." Draven's expression tightened, but he did not argue with her. Instead, he sat across from her near the fire, keeping enough distance that she did not feel cornered. "You are right to be cautious," he admitted. 2 years ago, a woman named Vesper came to this pack, claiming the same bond you are said to carry. I believed her. I gave her my trust, my protection, and eventually, my crown's authority beside my own. She used all of it to weaken my alliances, and nearly opened our borders to an enemy pack that would have slaughtered half this kingdom for land and power. Alara's anger softened slightly, replaced by something closer to understanding. That must have been difficult to survive. "It was not difficult," Draven said quietly. "It was humiliating. A king who cannot see betrayal standing beside his own throne is not fit to rule. Since then, I trust actions more than words, and I trust silence more than promises." "Then why bring me here at all?" Alara asked. "If you trust nothing, why not simply send me home?" Draven's gaze moved to the fire, watching the flames as though searching for an answer even he was uncertain of. "Because my wolf has not been silent in 3 months. It has been restless, aching, searching for something it cannot name. Tonight, when I stood close to you in that hall, it went quiet for the first time since that night the bond first stirred. I cannot ignore that, no matter how much my mind tells me to be careful." Alara looked down at her hands, twisting the fabric of her sleeve nervously. She thought of the ache she had felt 3 months ago, an ache she had never told anyone about because she feared sounding foolish. Hearing him describe the same restlessness made her stomach flip with a mixture of relief and fear. Relief, because she was not imagining things. Fear, because if this bond were real, her simple life as a village healer was over the moment she walked through the palace doors. "What happens if it is true?" she asked quietly. "What happens to someone like me, becoming whatever this makes me?" "You would be protected," Draven said, "recognized by the pack, given a place within these walls, and within the kingdom's future, whether either of us fully understands what that means yet. And if the nobles who supported you after Vesper's betrayal do not accept me?" Draven's jaw tensed. "They will have no choice but to accept what the bond confirms. A true mate bond cannot be faked, no matter how much some might wish otherwise." Alara studied him carefully, searching his face for any trace of the ruthless king the stories described. Instead, she found exhaustion, weariness, and something achingly human beneath the crown he wore. For the first time since being dragged into this hall, she allowed herself to consider that perhaps he was as trapped by this situation as she was, bound by a connection neither of them had chosen. "Tell me about your father," Draven said suddenly, surprising her with the shift in conversation. "He raised me alone after my mother passed," Alara said softly. "He taught me healing because he said knowledge was the only inheritance no one could take from me. He has been unwell for many months now, and I have done everything I can to ease his pain, but medicine is expensive, and our debts to the crown grow heavier each season." "What is his condition?" "A weakness in his lungs. Some nights, I fear I will wake to find he has stopped breathing entirely." Her voice cracked slightly, and she hated herself for showing such vulnerability in front of a king she barely knew. Yet something about the quiet chamber, the fire, and his unexpected patience made it difficult to keep her guard fully raised. Draven was silent for a long moment. "If the bond is confirmed tonight, his debts will be cleared, and the palace healers will attend to him personally. That much I can promise you, regardless of anything else that happens between us." Alara looked up at him, surprised by the offer. "You would do that, even if this bond means nothing but trouble for your throne?" "My throne has survived worse trouble than a healer's father needing care," Draven said, the faintest trace of dry humor slipping into his voice for the first time. "Besides, if you truly are my mate, it would reflect poorly on me to let your family suffer while I sit comfortably behind these walls." A small, unexpected laugh escaped Alara before she could stop it, and Draven's eyes flickered toward her with something like surprise, as though he had not expected to hear such a sound in this chamber tonight. The tension between them eased slightly, replaced by a fragile, cautious warmth neither of them fully trusted yet, but neither wished to extinguish either. As the night deepened, they spoke of smaller things, her work as a healer, the herbs she gathered from the forest edges, the quiet rhythms of village life so different from the grandeur of palace walls. Draven listened more than he spoke, something Alara had not expected from a king known for commanding rooms rather than listening within them. In turn, he shared pieces of his own life carefully, the weight of ruling a kingdom still healing from betrayal, the loneliness of a throne surrounded by advisors who feared him more than they understood him. Somewhere between the fire's slow burn and the quiet exchange of stories, the wariness between them began to soften into something neither had names for yet. Alara found herself studying the sharp lines of his face, the way his guarded expression occasionally slipped into something gentler when he spoke of things that mattered to him. Draven, in turn, found himself watching the way her hands moved when she spoke of her work, careful and precise, the hands of someone who had spent her life caring for others, rather than being cared for herself. "You are not what I expected," Draven admitted quietly, as the fire burned lower. "Neither are you," Alara replied honestly. Outside, the moon climbed higher above the palace, its silver light spilling gently across the chamber floor, illuminating two people caught between duty and doubt, fear, and something dangerously close to trust. Neither of them spoke of what the confirmed bond might mean beyond tonight, both too afraid to hope for something that could just as easily shatter beneath the weight of politics, betrayal, and the shadows of the past still lingering over the palace walls. But as the hours passed, and the fire dimmed to soft embers, something undeniable had already begun settling quietly between them. Something neither Alara nor Draven were ready to name, yet both could feel pulling steadily tighter with every word exchanged, every careful glance, every small crack in the walls they had each built to survive. Somewhere beyond the palace, unseen and unheard, whispers had already begun to spread through the kingdom about the healer summoned to the king's private chambers, whispers that would soon reach ears far less forgiving than Draven's own advisors, ears belonging to those who had profited greatly from the king's isolation after Vesper's betrayal, and who would not welcome a new bond, threatening to change everything they had carefully arranged in the shadows of his court. Alara woke sometime past midnight to the soft crackle of the dying fire, and the sound of low voices drifting through the slightly open door leading to the outer hallway. She had not meant to fall asleep in the chair near the window, exhausted from the long day, but something in the quiet safety of the chamber had allowed her guard to slip for the first time in hours. Draven had stepped out briefly, and she had drifted into a light rest, only to be pulled awake by the sound of his name. She sat still, listening carefully, unsure whether she should announce herself or remain silent. The voices belonged to General Colton and another guard she did not recognize, speaking in hushed, urgent tones just outside the door. "He cannot be serious about this one," the unfamiliar voice said. After everything Vesper did, he brings another woman into his private chambers within a single night's notice? He believes it is different this time, Colton replied, though his voice carried its own uncertainty. His wolf reacted the moment she entered the hall. You saw it yourself. His wolf reacted to Vesper too, if you recall. That did not stop her from nearly handing our kingdom to the Draymore pack. If this healer is discovered to be another false claim, or worse, working for someone seeking to finish what Vesper started, the damage to his rule could be irreversible. The nobles are already restless. Another failed bond, another betrayal so soon after the last, and there will be those who question whether he is fit to protect this kingdom at all. Alara's stomach twisted painfully as she listened, her heart pounding loud enough that she feared it might give away her wakefulness. She had not known the full extent of what happened with the woman named Vesper, only the brief explanation Draven had given her earlier. Hearing it discussed so bluntly, hearing the fear in the guards' voices about what might happen if she too were discovered to be untrustworthy, filled her with a dread she had not expected. And if she is discovered to be false, the unfamiliar guard continued, his voice dropping lower, what happens to her then? Does she simply return to her village unharmed, as he promised, or does the council demand something more permanent this time, to ensure no one else attempts such a claim against the crown again? Colton did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Alara sat frozen in the darkness of the chamber, her mind racing through everything she had just heard. She thought of her father, alone and unwell at home, waiting for a daughter who might not return if this bond proved false, or worse, if powerful men within this palace decided her presence was too dangerous a risk, regardless of the truth. She thought too of Draven's earlier words, his promise of protection, his gentleness by the fire, the way his guarded expression had softened as they spoke. But promises from a king under pressure from his own council were fragile things, she realized, especially a king already scarred by one betrayal and surrounded by advisors clearly prepared to protect the throne, by whatever means necessary, even at the cost of an innocent woman's safety. Panic began to build steadily in her chest, quiet but insistent, whispering that she had made a terrible mistake agreeing to this, that she had walked willingly into a den far more dangerous than she had understood, believing a single night's honesty from a stranger could shield her from the machinery of politics and fear surrounding his throne. The voices outside faded as Colton and the other guard moved further down the hallway, their conversation trailing into silence Alara could no longer make out. She remained still for a long while afterward, staring into the dying embers of the fire, her thoughts a storm of fear, doubt, and a strange, aching sadness she could not fully explain. When Draven returned to the chamber sometime later, he found her still seated by the window, though her posture had changed, tense and guarded in a way it had not been before he left. He studied her carefully, sensing immediately that something had shifted in the time he had been away. "Is something wrong?" he asked, closing the door quietly behind him. "I am simply tired," Alara said, forcing calm into her voice, even as her mind screamed with everything she had overheard. She did not tell him what she had heard. She did not know yet whether she could trust him with such a confession, whether admitting she had eavesdropped on his guards would only deepen the suspicion already surrounding her. Draven did not press her further, though the faint furrow in his brow suggested he did not fully believe her simple explanation. He settled into the chair across from her once more, and for a while, silence stretched comfortably enough between them that Alara almost allowed herself to relax again, almost allowed herself to believe the warmth they had shared earlier could outweigh the fear now coiled tightly in her chest. But every time she looked at him, she could not stop hearing the guard's cold question echoing in her mind. What happens to her then? Does she simply return to her village unharmed, or does the council demand something more permanent this time? The words settled deep into her bones, planting a seed of terror that no amount of gentle conversation could fully uproot. As the hours passed, and the fire burned lower still, Alara found herself watching Draven more carefully, searching his face for any sign of the ruthlessness his advisors clearly believed he was capable of when his throne felt threatened. She saw none of it in his expression, only quiet exhaustion, and something that looked disturbingly like hope, an emotion she suspected he rarely allowed himself to feel. And yet hope, from a king, surrounded by men willing to protect his crown at any cost, meant little if that same council decided her existence was too great a risk to allow. regardless of what his heart or his wolf believed to be true. By the time the moon began its slow descent toward the horizon, Elara had made a decision, though it filled her with a heaviness she had not expected. She could not risk her fate resting entirely on a bond that powerful men around this king seemed determined to view as another threat rather than a truth. She could not risk her father losing his only daughter to a council's cold judgment, should morning bring anything less than perfect confirmation, and she could not, no matter how gently Draven had treated her through the night, fully silence the fear that she had become a pawn in a game far larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined, stepping into a healer's simple life. She would leave before the council, before the guards, before anyone had the chance to decide her fate for her. She would leave before morning came, and she would find her own way to protect herself and her father, even if it meant walking away from a bond that, despite everything, had begun to feel unsettlingly, terrifyingly real. Draven, unaware of the decision quietly forming in the woman seated across from him, allowed his eyes to close briefly, exhaustion finally catching up to him after the long and unusual day. He did not know that within hours, the fragile trust beginning to build between them would be tested in a way neither of them could yet foresee, nor did he know that the woman he had begun, however cautiously, to hope might finally be the bond his wolf had been searching for, would soon be gone, before the first light of dawn touched the palace walls. Draven woke with the first pale light of dawn brushing against the tall windows, stretching lazily, before he registered the strange stillness in the room. He reached toward the chair where Elara had been seated hours before, expecting to find her still curled there in quiet sleep. Instead, he found the chair empty, the blanket he had draped over her shoulders folded neatly on its seat, as though she had taken great care not to leave any trace of disorder behind. He sat up quickly, scanning the chamber. The fire had burned completely to ash. The window she had gazed out of for much of the night stood slightly ajar, letting in the cool morning air. There was no note, no explanation, nothing except the unmistakable absence of the woman who had shared this room with him only hours before. "Elara," he called, though he already sensed there would be no answer. He rose and moved through the chamber, checking the small adjoining room and the balcony beyond the window, though he knew, even before he finished searching, that she was gone. A strange, hollow ache spread through his chest, sharper than he expected, deeper than simple surprise or frustration. It felt, disturbingly, like the same ache he had carried for 3 months before she entered his hall, except now it carried the fresh sting of loss, rather than the dull confusion of something missing and unnamed. He summoned General Colton immediately, his voice carrying a rare edge of urgency that made the guards outside straighten at once. Colton arrived within minutes, his expression shifting from confusion to concern, as Draven explained, in clipped, controlled sentences, that the woman brought before the council the previous night had vanished sometime before dawn, leaving no trace and no explanation. Perhaps she simply returned home, Colton offered carefully, though even he did not sound convinced. She would not have gotten past the palace guards without assistance, or without being seen, Draven said, pacing the length of the chamber, his wolf restless and agitated beneath his skin. Someone allowed her to leave, or she found a way we failed to anticipate. Either way, I want her found. Your Majesty, Colton said slowly. If she left willingly, perhaps it is best to let her go. If the bond was uncertain, perhaps she feared the consequences of remaining, especially given the concerns some among the council have already raised. Draven turned sharply toward him. What concerns exactly? Colton hesitated, clearly reluctant to repeat conversations meant to remain private among the king's advisors. Some fear another failed bond, so soon after Vesper's betrayal would weaken your standing further. There has been talk, Your Majesty, of ensuring any future false claims are handled more decisively than before, to discourage others from attempting similar schemes against the crown. A cold understanding settled over Draven as the pieces began fitting together. If Elara had overheard even a fraction of such discussions during the night, it would explain everything: her sudden departure, the careful way she had left no trace behind, the quiet unease he had sensed in her before he had drifted to sleep. She had not run because the bond was false. She had run because she feared what powerful men surrounding his throne might decide to do with her, regardless of the bond's truth. The realization struck him with a force sharper than any physical wound. He had spent the entire night convincing himself, cautiously and against every hard lesson Vesper had taught him, that Alara was different, that her honesty and her fear were genuine, that the ache his wolf had carried for months had finally, truly, found its answer. And in the middle of that fragile, dangerous hope, his own counsel had likely frightened her into fleeing before he ever had the chance to prove that hope was worth trusting. "Send trackers immediately," Draven ordered, his voice hard with barely restrained frustration, though it was directed far more at himself and his own guarded advisors than at the woman who had slipped quietly from his chambers before dawn. Quietly, "I do not want this handled as a hunt for a fugitive. I want her found and protected, not punished." "And if she does not wish to be found?" Colton asked carefully. Draven paused at the window, staring out over the awakening kingdom below, the pain in his chest sharpening with every passing moment she remained beyond his reach. "Then I will accept that when I hear it from her own voice, not from silence, and not from rumors twisted by fear." As Colton departed to arrange the search, Draven remained alone in the chamber, the weight of the empty room pressing heavily against him. He thought of her hands twisting nervously in her sleeves as she spoke of her father, the small, unexpected laugh she had allowed herself despite her fear, the quiet honesty in her eyes even when she had every reason to be guarded around a king she barely knew. None of it felt like deception. None of it felt like the calculated performance Vesper had once given so convincingly. And yet she was gone, and the ache in his chest, the same ache his wolf had carried unexplained for 3 long months, had returned tenfold now that the source of its brief relief had vanished before morning fully arrived. Meanwhile, far beyond the palace walls, Alara moved quickly and carefully through the quiet streets of the lower city, her heart still pounding from the tense, silent escape she had managed hours earlier. She had slipped from the chamber while Draven slept, moved through a servant's passage she had noticed near the window, and used the last hours of darkness to put as much distance between herself and the palace as she safely could, without drawing attention. She told herself, over and over, that she had made the right choice, that protecting herself and her father mattered more than a bond she barely understood, forged with a king, surrounded by advisors, willing to see her as a threat rather than a truth. And yet, even as she finally reached the edge of the lower village and slowed her pace, exhaustion and relief mingling uneasily in her chest, she could not fully ignore the strange hollow ache settling deep inside her, an ache that felt disturbingly similar to grief, though she told herself firmly it was simply exhaustion and fear finally catching up to her after such a long, impossible night. She did not yet know that her father's debts, mysteriously and without explanation, had already been cleared sometime before dawn, a quiet gesture from a king who had made a promise regardless of what the night's outcome proved. She did not yet know that her sudden departure would soon draw attention far more dangerous than the council's private fears, attention from those who believed a healer holding an Alpha King's unclaimed bond might be worth far more as leverage than as an enemy left unclaimed and unprotected. And she certainly did not yet know that the ache she carried walking away from the palace was not simply fear or exhaustion, but the unmistakable, undeniable pull of a bond severed too soon, one that would not remain quiet or ignored for long, no matter how far she walked, or how quickly she tried to disappear back into the simple life she had left behind only a day before. Alara reached her cottage just as the sun climbed fully above the hills, its warm light doing little to ease the cold unease still sitting heavily in her chest. She pushed open the familiar wooden door, breathing in the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke that had always meant safety to her, though tonight even that comfort felt distant and fragile. Her father, Edrin, sat propped up in his bed near the small hearth, his face pale but alert, his eyes widening with relief the moment she entered. "Alara," he said, his voice rough with worry, "where have you been?" "The guard said nothing when they took you. I feared the worst." "I am safe, father," she said, kneeling beside his bed and taking his frail hand in hers. "It is a long story, and one I am not certain I fully understand myself." She explained as gently as she could, choosing her words carefully to avoid frightening him further, describing the claim of a mate bond, the king's proposal, and her decision to leave before any final judgment could be made. She did not mention the conversation she had overheard, unwilling to burden him with fears that might not even come to pass. Edrin listened quietly, his expression growing increasingly troubled as she spoke. A bond with the Alpha King is not something easily walked away from, my daughter, he said carefully. If what you felt was real, it will not simply fade because you wish it to. I had no choice, Ilara said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them herself. I could not risk staying somewhere I was seen as a threat rather than a person. Before Edrin could respond, a soft knock sounded at the door, hesitant and quiet. Ilara rose cautiously, unsure who would be calling so early, and opened it to find her closest friend, Marisol, standing outside with a basket of bread, though her expression carried more urgency than her casual visit suggested. Ilara, Marisol said quickly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. You must be careful. Word has already spread through the lower village that you were taken to the palace last night, and that your father's debts to the crown were cleared this very morning, without explanation. People are already talking. Some believe you have gained the king's favor. Others believe far more dangerous things. Ilara's stomach tightened. What do you mean, dangerous things? Marisol lowered her voice further, glancing briefly toward the window, as though fearing unseen ears. There are those in this village, and beyond it, who have never accepted King Draven's rule easily, especially after the trouble 2 years ago, with the woman who nearly handed our kingdom to the Draymore pack. If they believe you hold some claim over the king, whether by bond or simply by rumor, you could become a target, not because of anything you have done, but because of what people believe you represent. Ilara sank into the chair near her father's bed, the weight of everything settling heavily upon her all at once. She had fled the palace believing she was escaping danger, only to realize now that leaving may have created a different kind of danger entirely, one rooted not in the king's counsel, but in the shadows of those who opposed his throne altogether. I only wanted to protect my father, Ilara said quietly, more to herself than to either of them. I did not ask for any of this. I know, Marisol said gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. But whether you asked for it or not, it has found you regardless. The question now is what you intend to do about it. Ilara did not have an answer, not yet. She spent the remainder of the day tending to her father, grinding herbs for his medicine, and trying desperately to focus on the familiar rhythms of her ordinary life, though the strange, hollow ache in her chest refused to fade no matter how busy she kept her hands. Every so often, she caught herself glancing toward the road leading out of the village, half expecting to see palace guards approaching, though whether she hoped for their arrival or dreaded it, she could not honestly say. As evening approached, a stranger arrived at the edge of the village, his cloak dark and unmarked, his manner quiet, but watchful. He did not approach Ilara's cottage directly, choosing instead to linger near the village well, speaking briefly with a few of the local merchants before moving further into the settlement, asking careful, seemingly casual questions about a healer said to have recently returned from the palace. Marisol noticed him first, her sharp instincts immediately wary of his presence, and hurried back to warn Ilara before the stranger could learn too much. Someone is asking about you, she said breathlessly, closing the cottage door firmly behind her. He does not wear the palace's colors, and he does not carry himself like a simple traveler. Ilara's heart sank. Whether this stranger served the council members she had overheard the night before, or some rival faction hoping to use her connection to the king for their own purposes, she could not be certain, and the uncertainty itself felt more frightening than any single, defined threat. I need to know who he is, Ilara said, steadying herself despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. I cannot simply wait here, hoping danger passes us by. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Ilara sat beside her father's bed, watching him breathe steadily in the dim candlelight, grateful at least that his condition had not worsened despite the day's stress. She thought of Draven, of the quiet warmth in his voice when he spoke of protecting her father, of the unexpected gentleness beneath his guarded exterior, and wondered, with a heaviness she could not shake, whether walking away from him had truly protected anyone at all, or whether it had simply traded one danger for another, far less predictable. Far beyond the village, within the palace walls, Draven stood before his assembled trackers, his expression carved from stone, as he gave clear, firm instructions to locate Ilara swiftly and discreetly, without alarming the village or drawing unwanted attention to her whereabouts. He did not yet know about the stranger asking careful questions near the village well, nor did he know how quickly the quiet rumors of a healer connected to the crown were already spreading into ears far less forgiving than his own counsel's cautious concerns. He only knew that the ache in his chest had not eased since morning, that his wolf remained restless and unsettled, and that somewhere beyond these walls, a woman he barely knew, yet could not stop thinking about, was walking directly into a danger neither of them yet fully understood. 2 days passed before Draven's trackers finally traced Alara's location to the southern village, though he had insisted on joining the search party himself, despite Colton's repeated warnings that a king wandering into the countryside without proper escort was reckless at best and dangerous at worst. Draven had waved away every objection. His wolf had grown increasingly restless with each passing hour, the ache in his chest sharpening into something closer to physical pain, a warning he could no longer ignore no matter how carefully his advisors urged patience. "She is close," he told Colton, as their small group approached the outskirts of the village under the cover of early evening light. "I can feel it." Colton studied him carefully, still uneasy about the entire situation. "Your Majesty, if word spreads that the king himself rode into a lower village, searching for a woman rumored to hold his mate bond, it will only fuel the very rumors we hope to avoid." "I no longer care about rumors," Draven said firmly. "I care about finding her before someone else does." He did not explain further, though the tightness in his voice suggested he knew more than he had shared with his general. Reports had reached the palace only that morning of a stranger asking careful questions in the southern village, a man later identified through quiet palace contacts as an agent connected to Lord Garrick, a nobleman who had long resented Draven's tightened control over the kingdom's trade routes, following Vesper's betrayal. If Garrick's people had learned of Alara's connection to the crown, there was no telling what lengths they might go to in order to use her as leverage against the throne, whether through coercion, threat, or worse. As they entered the village proper, the streets quiet in the fading light, Draven's senses sharpened immediately, his wolf pulling him instinctively toward a modest cottage near the village's edge. He dismounted quickly, ignoring Colton's cautious call to wait for the rest of the guards to position themselves, and strode directly toward the small wooden door. Before he could knock, the door opened from within, and Alara stood frozen in the doorway, clearly startled by his sudden, unexpected arrival. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick with everything left unsaid since she had slipped from his chambers before dawn, 2 mornings before. "You came here yourself," she said finally, her voice quiet with disbelief. "I told you I would find you," Draven replied, his tone carrying none of the anger she had expected, only a raw, exhausted relief that surprised her far more than his presence itself. "Why did you run, Alara?" She hesitated, glancing briefly past him toward the darkening street, still uncertain whether it was safe to speak openly, even now. "May I explain inside? There are things you should know, and things I fear may already be more dangerous than either of us realized." Draven followed her inside, ducking beneath the low doorway, his eyes immediately finding Edrin resting near the small hearth, watching the king's arrival, with a mixture of astonishment and quiet wariness. Draven offered the older man a respectful nod, before turning his full attention back to Alara. "I overheard your guards the night I stayed in your chambers," she admitted finally, the words rushing out now that the moment had arrived. "General Colton and another man, discussing what might happen if the bond proved false, or if I were discovered to be a danger to your throne. They spoke of ensuring future claims were handled more decisively than before. I feared what that might mean for me, especially given everything you had told me about Vesper. I did not run because I doubted the bond, Draven. I ran because I feared what your own council might decide to do with me, regardless of whether it was true." Draven's expression shifted through several emotions at once: disbelief, frustration, and finally a heavy, sinking guilt, as understanding settled fully upon him. "That conversation," he said slowly, "was not about you specifically. It was a general concern, spoken carelessly perhaps, but never intended as a threat against you directly." "I did not know that," Alara said. "All I knew was fear, and very little time to decide whether trusting a stranger's promise was worth risking everything I have left, including my father's safety." Draven closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of her words, recognizing now how deeply his own counsel's careless caution had nearly cost him the very bond he had spent 2 days desperately searching to reclaim. "I should have protected you from those fears the moment they began forming," he said quietly. "That failure is mine, not yours." Before Alara could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door, urgent and heavy, followed immediately by Marisol's frightened voice calling from outside. "Alara, the stranger has returned, and he is not alone this time. There are others with him, armed, moving quickly toward your cottage." Draven's entire posture shifted instantly, the exhausted relief of moments before, replaced by sharp, commanding alertness. "How many?" he asked, moving immediately toward the door. "I counted at least 5, Marisol said breathlessly, as Draven stepped outside, quickly assessing the darkening street, where shadowy figures were indeed beginning to close in from multiple directions, moving with the disciplined precision of trained fighters, rather than simple bandits. Colton and the remaining guards, alerted by the commotion, moved swiftly to position themselves protectively around the cottage, though the approaching group clearly outnumbered their small escort. Draven's wolf surged forward beneath his skin, sharp and ready, every instinct honed by years of leading his pack through danger, now fully focused on the immediate threat closing in around the woman he had crossed half the kingdom to find. "Get inside and stay with your father," Draven ordered Alara firmly, though she hesitated at the doorway, unwilling to simply hide, while danger unfolded, because of a connection to her that she had never fully chosen. "These men are here because of rumors surrounding me," she said. "I will not simply hide, while others fight a battle caused by my presence." "You will do exactly that," Draven said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a king accustomed to being obeyed, though beneath the command, Alara heard something far more personal, something close to desperation. "I have already lost you once, these past 2 days. I will not risk losing you again tonight." The urgency in his voice, the raw fear beneath his commanding tone, finally convinced her, and she stepped back into the cottage, pulling the door nearly closed behind her, while still watching carefully through the narrow gap, her heart pounding, as the armed strangers advanced steadily closer through the fading evening light, their intentions, whatever they truly were, growing more dangerously clear with every passing second. The leader of the approaching group stepped forward into the dim light spilling from a nearby lantern post, his face partially hidden beneath a dark hood, though his voice carried a calm, calculated confidence that immediately marked him as someone accustomed to giving orders rather than following them. "King Draven," he said smoothly, "how fortunate that we find you here, far from your palace guards and your council's protection." "State your purpose," Draven said sharply, his stance shifting into a coiled readiness that made it clear he had no intention of allowing this confrontation to unfold peacefully unless the intruders chose otherwise. "My purpose is simple," the man replied. "Lord Garrick believes the kingdom would benefit greatly from a king less confident in his own bonds, and a healer connected to your throne, willing or otherwise, would make an excellent bargaining piece to remind you exactly how fragile your current position remains." Colton stepped forward, positioning himself protectively beside Draven. "You would openly threaten the crown itself. That alone is treason, worthy of severe punishment." "Treason," the hooded man said with a faint, unsettling laugh, "is only a crime when the one accusing you still holds enough power to enforce it. After Vesper's betrayal, many within this kingdom question exactly how much power King Draven truly has left." Draven's wolf surged forward sharply at the challenge, his patience thinning rapidly as the tension in the street grew heavier with every passing second. "You will find," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerously quiet register, "that I still hold more than enough power to protect what belongs to me." The confrontation erupted swiftly, the hooded man's companions moving in coordinated bursts toward the cottage, though Draven's guards, trained and disciplined despite being outnumbered, met the advance with immediate, practiced precision. Draven himself moved with the controlled ferocity of a king who had spent years honing both his mind and his body for exactly this kind of danger, disarming one attacker before turning swiftly to intercept another who had broken away from the main group, moving directly toward the cottage door, where Alara remained hidden. Inside, Alara watched through the narrow gap in the doorway, her heart hammering violently as she witnessed the chaos unfolding just beyond the threshold. When she saw one of the attackers break away from the fighting, moving with clear intent toward her father's cottage, every instinct screamed at her to act, rather than remain passively hidden while danger closed in. She grabbed the heavy iron poker resting beside the hearth, gripping it tightly, as she positioned herself protectively in front of her father's bed, refusing to allow fear to paralyze her completely, despite every nerve in her body trembling with dread. The attacker reached the door just as Draven intercepted him from behind, pulling him back sharply before he could force his way inside, the brief struggle ending swiftly, as Draven's superior strength and controlled fury overwhelmed the man's resistance within moments. The remaining attackers, seeing their numbers thinning rapidly against Draven's disciplined guards and the king's own formidable skill, began retreating into the shadows beyond the village's edge, their hooded leader casting one final, cold glance toward the cottage, before disappearing into the darkness alongside his remaining companions. Silence fell heavily over the street once the immediate danger had passed, broken only by the ragged breathing of the guards and the distant sound of frightened villagers beginning cautiously to emerge from their homes now that the chaos had subsided. Draven turned immediately toward the cottage, his expression tight with lingering adrenaline and fresh concern, pushing the door open to find Alara still standing protectively beside her father's bed, the iron poker gripped tightly in her trembling hands. "You are unharmed?" he asked urgently, crossing the small room in a few quick strides. "I am," Alara said, lowering the poker slowly, as the adrenaline began draining from her body, leaving exhaustion and shaken relief in its place. "Draven, that man spoke of Lord Garrick. Why would a nobleman send armed men after a simple village healer?" Draven's expression darkened further. "Because you are no longer simply a village healer in the eyes of those seeking any advantage against my throne, Alara. Whether the bond between us is fully confirmed or not, rumors alone have made you a target for those who wish to see my rule weakened. This danger will not disappear simply because you distanced yourself from the palace." Alara sank slowly into the chair beside her father's bed, the full weight of the past 2 days finally catching up with her all at once. "Then leaving accomplished nothing," she said quietly. "I ran to protect myself and my father, and instead, I very nearly brought danger directly to our door." "You could not have known," Draven said gently, kneeling beside her chair so that their eyes met directly. "None of this danger is your fault, Alara. It belongs entirely to men like Garrick, who seek to exploit fear and rumor for their own gain, and to a council that spoke carelessly, without understanding how deeply their words might frighten someone caught in the middle of circumstances far beyond her choosing." Edrin, watching quietly from his bed throughout the tense exchange, finally spoke, his voice weak but steady. "Your Majesty, forgive my boldness, but it seems to me that whatever bond exists between you and my daughter, true or otherwise, has already placed her in danger, regardless of distance or denial. Perhaps the wisest path forward is not further separation, but honest confrontation of whatever truth this bond holds, protected properly this time, rather than left vulnerable to assumption and rumor alike." Draven turned to look at the older man, respect settling into his expression at the quiet wisdom offered, despite Edrin's frail condition. "Your father speaks wisely," he said, turning back to Alara. "Running has only delayed the truth, Alara, not escaped it. Whatever exists between us deserves to be faced directly, with full protection this time, rather than left to fester in fear and rumor until it grows dangerous enough to threaten your very safety." Alara looked between her father's steady, encouraging gaze and Draven's earnest, exhausted expression, the fear and uncertainty of the past 2 days slowly giving way to a quiet, reluctant understanding that perhaps running had never truly been the answer she believed it to be. "Then let us face it," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "Whatever truth this bond holds, I would rather know it fully than continue living in fear of shadows and rumors I cannot control." Draven's expression shifted into something close to profound relief, though the danger of the evening's confrontation still lingered heavily around them, a clear reminder that whatever truth waited to be confirmed between them, powerful enemies had already begun moving against it, and against her, with a determination that would not simply fade because peace had briefly returned to a quiet village street. Draven insisted on remaining in the village overnight, unwilling to risk another attack while Alara and her father remained vulnerable, and Colton reluctantly arranged for additional guards to secure the surrounding streets, while the king himself kept careful watch near the cottage. Sleep came slowly for both Alara and Draven that night, each caught in their own thoughts about the danger that had so nearly reached them, and about the fragile, uncertain bond that had somehow survived 2 days of fear, distance, and now open conflict. In the quiet hours before dawn, Ilara stepped outside briefly for fresh air, finding Draven seated on the low stone wall, bordering the cottage garden, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on the fading stars above. She hesitated only a moment before joining him, settling onto the wall a respectful distance away, though the space between them felt smaller than it had even in his grand palace chambers days before. "You did not sleep," she observed quietly. "Neither did you," he replied, a faint, tired smile touching his lips, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the events of the previous night settling slowly into something more manageable now that immediate danger had passed. Finally, Ilara spoke, her voice careful but honest. "I want to understand this bond fully, Draven, not through fear or rumor, but through truth. Can you explain it to me properly, the way it should have been explained from the very beginning?" Draven nodded slowly, turning to face her directly. "A true mate bond forms between two souls destined to complete one another, recognized instinctively by our wolves, long before our minds fully understand it. It cannot be faked or forced, though false claims like Vesper's can mimic its early signs closely enough to deceive even careful hearts, at least for a time. A true bond deepens naturally through honesty, trust, and shared vulnerability, strengthening, rather than weakening, the longer two people remain close, rather than fading or growing suspicious under pressure." "And what have you felt since that first night in the hall?" Ilara asked. "Peace," Draven admitted quietly. "For the first time in 3 months, my wolf has been calm rather than restless, except during the hours you were gone, when the ache returned sharper than ever before. That absence taught me clearly enough what your presence truly means, far more convincingly than any single night's proximity could have proven alone." Ilara considered his words carefully, weighing them against her own experience these past few days, the strange ache she had carried since fleeing the palace, the quiet relief she had felt the moment she saw him standing at her cottage door, despite every fear surrounding his arrival. "I felt something similar," she admitted softly, "an emptiness I could not explain, no matter how firmly I told myself I had made the right choice in leaving." Draven reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and gently took her hand in his. The moment their fingers intertwined, a warmth spread quietly between them, steady and calm rather than overwhelming, a quiet confirmation neither of them needed further words to understand. "I do not wish to force anything upon you, Ilara," Draven said carefully. "Not the bond, not the crown, not a life you never asked to be part of. But I would very much like the chance to build genuine trust between us, properly this time, protected from rumor, fear, and the shadows of those who wish to see either of us fail." Ilara studied their joined hands for a long moment, before finally meeting his eyes fully. "I would like that as well," she said. "But Draven, if I am to stand beside you, truly beside you, your counsel must understand that fear and careless words nearly cost you this bond entirely. I will not be treated as a threat to be managed, nor as a convenient political solution to strengthen your throne. I wish to be seen and respected as myself, healer and village daughter, as much as anything this bond might make me." "You have my word," Draven said firmly. "And more than words, you will have my actions to prove it, starting today." As dawn fully broke over the village, Draven summoned Colton and explained clearly his intentions moving forward, that Ilara would return to the palace, not as an uncertain claim to be tested and doubted, but as a woman under his direct protection, while the bond between them was allowed to develop naturally, free from the council's fearful scheming, and free from the shadow of powerful nobles like Garrick, who sought to exploit rumor for their own advantage. Colton, though still cautious, recognized the firm resolve in his king's voice, and nodded his agreement, understanding that whatever uncertainty remained about the bond's ultimate confirmation, Draven's determination to protect Ilara properly this time left no room for further debate among the council. Arrangements were made swiftly to ensure Edrin could travel comfortably alongside his daughter, palace healers already prepared to attend to his condition the moment they arrived, exactly as Draven had promised days before despite the chaos that had unfolded since. Marisol, tearful but proud, embraced Ilara warmly before their departure, promising to visit the palace once matters settled, her earlier fears easing slightly, now that the king's genuine intentions had become clear through action, rather than empty promise alone. As their small procession finally departed the village, moving steadily toward the palace, under far heavier protection than Ilara had traveled with days before, she found herself glancing occasionally toward Draven, riding calmly beside her, rather than ahead, in commanding isolation, as he might have days earlier. Something had shifted meaningfully between them through the danger and honesty of the past 2 days, a fragile trust now built not on a single desperate night, but on shared vulnerability, honest fear, and the undeniable relief of finding one another again, despite every obstacle placed deliberately in their path. Neither of them yet knew how the palace council would ultimately react to Draven's firm new resolve, nor how deeply Lord Garrick's ambitions might still threaten the peace they had only just begun rebuilding. But for the first time since this entire journey began within the cold, uncertain walls of the Great Hall, both Ilara and Draven rode forward together, with something neither had expected to find so quickly amid such danger, a quiet, steady hope that whatever challenges still waited ahead, they would face them honestly, and they would face them together. News of the attack in the southern village reached the palace council before Draven's procession even arrived, carried swiftly by messengers eager to report such significant events to the nobles who had long positioned themselves as guardians of the crown's stability. By the time Draven led Ilara and her father through the palace gates, the great hall had already filled with anxious murmurs, council members gathering hastily to discuss what many were calling a dangerous escalation threatening the kingdom's fragile peace. Lord Garrick himself stood prominently among the assembled nobles, his expression carefully arranged into concern rather than guilt, though Draven's sharp gaze lingered on him with unmistakable suspicion the moment their eyes met across the crowded hall. "Your Majesty," Garrick said smoothly as Draven approached the throne, Ilara and Edrin following closely behind, under the watchful protection of Colton's guards. "We have heard troubling reports of an attack near the southern village. The council is understandably concerned about the growing instability surrounding this healer's presence in matters of the crown." "How curious," Draven said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm as he settled onto his throne, "that you speak of instability, Lord Garrick, when the attackers themselves openly claimed to serve your interests before they were driven off." A sharp murmur rippled through the hall, and Garrick's carefully composed expression flickered briefly, before smoothing over again. "Your Majesty, surely you do not believe such wild accusations from desperate criminals seeking to shift blame away from their own reckless actions." "I believe the word of my own guards, who fought alongside me against those very attackers," Draven said firmly, "and I believe the timing of an armed assault occurring mere days after private council discussions regarding this healer's fate, discussions that somehow found their way beyond these walls despite their supposedly confidential nature." The hall fell into tense silence, several council members exchanging uneasy glances as the weight of Draven's accusation settled fully among them. Garrick, sensing the shifting mood, straightened defensively. "Your Majesty, I have served this crown faithfully for many years. To suggest I would orchestrate violence against an innocent healer is a grave accusation without proper evidence." "Then perhaps," Draven said, rising slowly from his throne, "we should discuss evidence properly. Lord Garrick, beginning with the hooded man captured during last night's confrontation, currently held securely within palace custody, quite willing to speak, in exchange for leniency, regarding the full extent of his punishment." Garrick's composure finally cracked visibly, a flash of genuine alarm crossing his features before he could fully mask it. Colton, understanding the king's intention, gestured to 2 guards standing near the hall's entrance, who promptly escorted forward the very man who had led the attack the previous night, his hood removed and his hands bound securely before him. "Speak plainly," Draven commanded, his voice carrying throughout the silent hall. "Who ordered the attack against the healer and her family?" The captured man, clearly weighing his diminishing options, finally lowered his gaze and spoke. "Lord Garrick provided the coin and the instruction, Your Majesty. He believed a weakened bond, or a healer removed entirely from the situation, would sufficiently destabilize your standing among the council, opening opportunities he has long sought regarding the kingdom's trade agreements." Gasps and urgent whispers spread rapidly through the hall as the full weight of the confession settled among the assembled nobles. Garrick, recognizing the impossibility of further denial, straightened with what little dignity remained available to him. Whatever mistakes I have made, Your Majesty, they were made out of genuine concern for this kingdom's stability, not simple malice. Concern for stability does not require armed men attacking an innocent family in their own home, Draven said coldly. Your actions, Lord Garrick, constitute clear treason against the crown, and you will be held accordingly, while the full council determines appropriate judgment. Guards moved swiftly to escort Garrick from the hall, his protests fading quickly into the tense silence left behind. Draven turned his attention back to the remaining council members, his expression firm and unwavering. Let this serve as clear reminder to anyone else within these walls who might consider using fear, rumor, or violence to manipulate matters of this crown for personal gain. I will not tolerate such actions, regardless of rank or history of service. The council members, visibly shaken by the swift and decisive resolution, murmured their acknowledgments, several bowing their heads respectfully toward the throne. Draven then turned to Alara, who had watched the entire exchange with a mixture of relief and lingering disbelief at how quickly justice had unfolded before her. This kingdom owes you an apology, Alara, Draven said, his voice softening as he addressed her directly before the full assembly. Not only for the danger you faced because of careless words spoken within these walls, but for the fear and uncertainty this entire situation forced upon you and your family from the very beginning. Alara stepped forward slightly, aware of every eye in the hall now turned toward her, though she found, surprisingly, that the fear which had gripped her so tightly in this same hall days before had eased considerably, replaced by a steadier, quieter confidence, born from everything she had survived since. I accept your apology, Your Majesty, she said clearly, though I hope this kingdom understands, moving forward, that fear and rumor serve no one well, especially when directed against those simply caught within circumstances beyond their choosing. A murmur of approval rippled through several council members, and even General Colton allowed a small, respectful nod in her direction, his earlier caution regarding her presence clearly softened by the courage she had displayed throughout the ordeal. Draven watched her carefully, pride and something deeper, warmer, settling firmly into his expression as he addressed the hall once more. The bond between myself and Alara Voss will be properly and fully confirmed in the coming days, following traditions befitting both the crown and her own dignity, as a woman who has proven, through danger and honesty alike, precisely the kind of strength and integrity this kingdom needs standing beside its throne, Draven announced firmly. Let it be known throughout this council, and throughout this kingdom, that she stands here not as an uncertain claim to be tested, but as a mate earned through truth, protected fully under my crown from this moment forward. The hall erupted into a mixture of surprised murmurs and cautious applause, the weight of recent danger slowly giving way to something resembling genuine hope for stability restored. Edrin, watching from where he had been carefully seated near the hall's edge, allowed himself a proud, relieved smile as he observed his daughter standing tall before the very throne that had once summoned her in fear and confusion, now standing instead in quiet, hard-earned strength. The days that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation, unlike anything Alara had ever known. Palace healers attended to her father with careful expertise, easing his condition steadily enough that color slowly returned to his cheeks for the first time in many months, a gift Alara found herself grateful for, far beyond any title or ceremony now approaching. Marisol arrived from the village a few days later, overwhelmed by the grandeur of palace life, though her steady friendship remained a comforting constant amid so much unfamiliar change. Draven, true to his word, worked closely alongside Alara throughout the preparations, ensuring she never felt like a mere formality being arranged for the council's satisfaction, but rather an equal partner shaping the ceremony, meant to properly confirm the bond between them. He introduced her personally to pack members throughout the palace, patiently answering her many questions about traditions and responsibilities she would soon carry, and made certain General Colton and the remaining council members treated her with the full respect her position now demanded. On the evening before the confirmation ceremony, Alara found herself standing once again beside the tall windows of Draven's private chambers, the same room where this entire journey had first begun, only a short time ago, though it felt now like an entirely different lifetime. Draven joined her quietly, studying her thoughtful expression with careful attention. "You are nervous," he observed gently. "A little," Alara admitted, with a small, honest laugh. It seems strange, doesn't it? A healer from a small village, standing before an entire kingdom, confirmed as the Alpha King's mate. A few short weeks ago, I would never have imagined such a thing possible. Strange perhaps, Draven said, moving to stand beside her, but not unearned. You have shown more courage through this ordeal than many warriors I have commanded through actual battle. That, more than any bond alone, is precisely why this kingdom will be fortunate to call you its queen. Alara turned to face him fully, warmth spreading through her chest at his words, though it was not merely his praise that stirred such feeling, but the quiet, steady certainty she now felt whenever she stood close to him, the same peaceful recognition he had once described his wolf feeling from their very first meeting. I could not have faced any of this without you, she said softly. Even when I ran, even when fear nearly convinced me to disappear entirely, some part of me always knew you would come. I simply did not yet understand why I trusted that so completely. Because the bond does not lie, even when fear tries desperately to convince us otherwise, Draven said, reaching gently to brush a stray strand of hair from her face. We simply needed the chance, and the honesty, to let it prove itself properly, free from rumor and danger, clouding the truth. The following morning, the great hall filled once more, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the tension or suspicion that had marked Alara's first fearful appearance within these walls. Instead, warmth and quiet celebration filled the space, as pack members, nobles and villagers who had traveled from the southern settlement gathered together to witness the confirmation ceremony, joining their king formally to the woman who had proven her worth, through courage rather than mere claim alone. Alara stood before the throne once more, though this time she wore garments befitting her new position, simple yet elegant, chosen carefully to honor both her heritage as a healer and her new role within the palace. Draven stood beside her rather than above her, a deliberate choice meant to symbolize the partnership he intended their bond to represent, rather than a hierarchy demanding her subservience. General Colton, now fully convinced of Alara's genuine character after everything she had endured and overcome, stepped forward to lead the ceremony's formal proceedings, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hushed hall as he recited the traditional words confirming a true mate bond before the full assembly of witnesses. When the moment finally arrived for Draven and Alara to exchange their formal vows, Draven turned to face her fully, taking both her hands gently in his own. Before this kingdom, and before the bond that first called out to me in the darkness, 3 months before we ever met, I claim you, Alara Voss, not as a solution to political uncertainty, nor as a convenient answer to a wolf's restlessness, but as my equal, my partner, and my mate, chosen freely and protected fully from this day forward. Alara, her eyes bright with emotion she no longer felt any need to hide, answered in turn. Before this kingdom, and before the courage it demanded of me to walk away, and the greater courage it demanded of me to return, I accept this bond, Draven Ashgrove, not as a healer suddenly elevated beyond her origins, but as a woman who chose honesty over fear, and who chooses now, fully and freely, to stand beside you as your equal, for as long as this bond calls us together. The hall erupted into warm, genuine celebration as their vows concluded, the formal bond now fully and publicly confirmed before the entire kingdom. Edrin watched proudly from among the honored guests, his health continuing to improve steadily under the palace healer's careful attention, while Marisol wiped happy tears from her eyes beside him, overwhelmed with joy for her closest friend's remarkable journey. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Draven and Alara eventually slipped away briefly to the same balcony overlooking the kingdom, where Draven had first explained the nature of their bond only days before. The city below glowed warmly beneath the evening stars, peaceful and unaware of how close its stability had come to unraveling entirely, saved instead by honesty, courage, and a bond neither of them had asked for, yet both had ultimately chosen to embrace fully. No more running, Draven said softly, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the kingdom settle into peaceful evening rest below. No more running, Alara agreed, leaning comfortably into his side, the ache that had once haunted them both, now replaced entirely by quiet, steady contentment. Only forward, together, whatever challenges this kingdom brings next. And as the stars shone brightly above the Ashgrove Palace, King Draven and his newly confirmed queen stood together in comfortable silence, their bond no longer a fragile uncertainty, tested by fear and rumor, but a steady, unshakable truth, ready to guide their kingdom forward into whatever future awaited them, faced always, from this moment onward, honestly, and together.